Today's episode of the TribCast is brought to you by Ambassador Tony Garza and the Texas Tribune Speakers Bureau. Welcome to this week's episode of the TribCast. I am James Barragan. With me, as always, is intrepid women's health reporter Eleanor Klibanoff.
Hello,
How are
James.
you, Eleanor?
I'm good. How are you?
You like that intro, huh?
I'm very intrepid. Everyone says it.
And our guest this week is Alejandro Serrano, who has been writing a fair amount about our subject of the week, immigration. Alejandro, how are you?
Good. How are y'all? Thank you for having me.
Great. We're very excited. Before we get started, let's check in. How are we doing, folks? Have we recovered from the Super Bowl and from the Kansas City Chiefs laying an absolute egg in the Super Bowl, preventing our guy Travis Kelce from proposing to Taylor Swift in the most man move that could possibly be done in front of thousands of people just trying to watch sports?
Okay, as we've established, not a sports podcast. We don't know that much about sports, but I will
We're gonna
say
lean into this,
we're going to lean into this.
Come for the sports.
You come to us for the sports, and while we have you here, we will back into some Texas politics. I will say personally, a little known fact about me is that I lived in Philadelphia until I was 11 years old. So I am a halfway Eagles fan. I tend to root for the Eagles when given the chance.
For
yes,
those
fly
watching
Eagles
on YouTube.
fly.
Right.
And then I moved to Atlanta, so I am also a halfway Falcons fan who, when given the chance to choose which of those teams to root for in a Super Bowl, the Eagles are doing a better showing than the Falcons.
I thought you were going to just say, I'm rooting for the birds.
I'm rooting for the birds, yeah. So I had a great time watching the Super Bowl. I thought I like to see one team really kick the hell out of the other. It's more fun that way.
Alejandro, do you have thoughts on the Super Bowl?
I thought it was boring.
Wow.
I don't like blowouts.
Hot take.
Yeah.
Wow.
After the third quarter, I was checked out.
Me too. I was just reading reviews of the Kendrick Lamar halftime show, which people went crazy for, like on both ends.
Yeah, very divisive.
Yeah.
I do think to a certain extent, is everything just very divisive now? Maybe.
Those pants weren't. I kind of like the pants.
People generally like the pants.
The fit,
People-
I thought in general, I liked
flare
the,
jeans. Yeah.
You left in the third quarter, so did President Trump.
Yeah.
You left a little early, I
Correct.
think.
And actually, funny that you bring that up, because not to inject politics into this podcast.
It's the only thing we know how to do.
But President Trump was there, and I read in the AP that this is the first time that a sitting president was in attendance at the Super Bowl. I just thought that was interesting, because we've had big sports fans. President Bush used to own a baseball team, and
Right, that does surprise
President
me.
Obama was a big basketball guy. He used to fill out the March Madness bracket all the time.
Do you think it's like a security thing?
Yeah, I think the Secret Service
Yeah, I'd
boss is,
say it's that. Yeah, I'd say it might be.
It's pretty
That makes sense. I really, I would think there's like nothing more American than going to watch the Super Bowl as the president. Like the president should be like, you have to go watch the last game of the World Series. Like you have to be the person who like benights. You know, like in the UK when they have like the FA Cup, Prince William goes and hands them the trophy.
Wow,
I know a lot about the Royals. I don't know that much about football, but I do know a lot about the Royals.
Kind of a sports expert.
Kind of a sports expert. But I think we should make the president do that. Like you give the World Series trophy, unless it's one of the Canadian teams. You give the NFL, the trophy.
Yeah.
The Stanley Cup.
Yeah.
How many trophies can I name?
I think you cheated and you
I think
beefed
I've
up
reached
on
my
your
limit.
sports.
The Stanley Cup, the World Series, the Super Bowl. What other sports are there?
The MLS Cup, the Los
MLS
Angeles
Cup.
Galaxy 6-time champion.
Oh,
MLS
and the
Cups.
and the basketball. What do they call that?
I don't know. The NBA
championship?
trophy.
The NBA trophy? Oh my God, guys! Sorry, we extended past
Yes,
our
sorry.
knowledge.
Alejandro, thank you for joining us on the
On
sports
to the
podcast.
things we do know about.
Okay, let's get to the real topic at hand. It's a big one this week, and it's immigration. President Trump promised to do mass deportations starting on day one. He promised to continue building the wall. He promised to give the death penalty to any migrant who killed an American citizen. All these big promises, big, sometimes controversial items, and he's hit the ground running. I mean, it's only been a couple of weeks that he's been in office, and it seems like from watching your team trying to follow this news, it's very hard. It's like drinking from a fire hydrant. So, Alejandro, so far, what are you seeing from the Trump administration's immigration plan? It certainly looks like it's been a blitz. to continue our football references. But do we see any coherent plan here, or is it just, as a Texas football fan would say, all gas, no brakes?
Yeah, I think it's definitely been a blitz. I mean, Trump has done a lot. He ended use of an app asylum-seeking migrants would use to schedule an appointment.
That's CBP1, right?
Yeah, with immigration officials. He's removed temporary protections some people had. He's also delegated more authority to state officials in some cases. But I think the overall plan is not yet clear, and it kind of seems like still a lot's unfolding. But it certainly has been a flurry of things that have already impacted people.
It's interesting, like the really tangible things, like so quickly, like the app went down, right? Like, that was pretty soon after inauguration. So there's like these tangible things, as well as these like large policy changes that take a while to see the impact of.
Right, and as anticipated, I mean, some of the stuff's being litigated. Like one of the hallmark promises was ending birthright citizenship. And a lot of people were like, well, you can't just get rid of the 14th Amendment, and now it's become a legal battle in which a judge has so far said, you can't.
Yeah, and on the CBP1 front, I mean, on the app, you and your colleague Uriel Garcia wrote a story about some of the migrants who were waiting around, right, and just trying to get their asylum claims to go, and they were waiting, and their meetings were suddenly canceled, right? So it's an immediate impact of the new administration coming in and having an immigration crackdown.
Yeah.
Can I ask you to put you to the test really quickly and briefly catch us up on birthright citizenship, like what it is, why it's controversial?
Yeah, it's the 14th Amendment pretty much grants this, as I understand it. I haven't been covering this a lot.
Sure. Give us the Alejandro Serrano version, and I'm sure we'll get emails if you, even if you get it right.
The long and short of it is, if you have a child in this country, they are an American citizen. And it has been this way for a long time, and Trump wanted to end this. But it is encoded by the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, so a president doesn't have the authority to just override the Constitution. You need a congressional amendment, which is kind of now where the battle is turning, and it's unclear what's next.
And it's one of the amendments that got passed after the Civil War, and it enfranchises people. It gives them personhood. It gives them citizenship, because previously, of course, enslaved people did not have any of those rights. So this goes far back a long way, more than a century. So we're talking about radical changes to the Constitution. Alejandro, numerous state officials, including Governor Abbott, Lieutenant Governor Patrick, Land Commissioner Don Buckingham, they've said that they're hoping to offer the federal government help. And we've seen the National Guard be deployed, as well as state troopers. We've seen Land Commissioner Buckingham offer to provide the federal government some land for detention and mass deportations. How's the state working with the feds? Like, what's that partnership looking like? They've obviously been they've cooperated together in the past, right? But how is this different?
Yeah, I mean, I think one way to clearly look at it is the last 4 years, a lot of state officials felt like they were in opposition with the federal government. And Texas had conflicts with the federal government when it came to immigration enforcement, and now it's the opposite, and they have a willing partner. So Texas is kind of going out of its way and being like, hey, we want to help. So what does that look like on the ground? Well, the governor's directed state agencies to cooperate with federal officials. He signed an agreement with the Trump administration to give National Guard troops immigration arrest authority. And those are kind of some of the bigger things. Then you have tinier things like that are not clear yet. For instance, you brought up the land commissioner offering land. We don't know yet that a lease has been signed, but we know the administration said it wants the land. So it presents all these other questions of, well, what does that partnership look like? But the biggest thing here is like now it's like two allies working toward the same goal instead of in opposition of each other, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and will that, one of the things that we were talking about in some of our budget talks is, will that lead to savings on the immigration front? Because theoretically, with the federal partner now, maybe the state can pull back. But what are you learning about whether the state can take some of those billions of dollars that it's invested and leave it to the federal government and maybe turn those billions of dollars towards something else in the budget?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a great question and point, and it's kind of unclear right now. And if anything, kind of what the signals we're getting out of all these components, right, what state officials are doing, the legislature, which is just starting in earnest its budget negotiations, is that Texas is going to double down on border security and kind of further cement this role it has in border security. The legislature is considering $6.5 billion of funding toward border security. And when you think about $11 billion that we spent the last 4 years as a state, 6.5 is kind of a step more. It's not more than has been appropriated, but it's also not less. So it's kind of saying something. But also as a state, we have to remember that we've done things that have also advanced this cementation, if that's a word.
Let's go with it. Yeah.
And I think the kind of like the hallmark thing recently is Senate Bill 4, which would give state police the authority to arrest people suspected of being undocumented. And it's still being litigated. But, when we think about Texas's role in immigration enforcement, all these things have to be considered. And I'm sorry, I forgot what you asked.
No, but I mean, there's no evidence. I think there's like a version of events, or maybe even like a thing some people like, you might think like, oh, okay, like now Texas has this partner in the White House. Like they can be like, for years they've been saying like to the Biden administration, like, do more. Now we can presume President Trump is going to do more. And like you would think Texas, one version of events is Texas says like, great, we can sit back on our laurels. We can let you do, we're going to work on this other issue. And I think that is foolish to think that that's how that was going to go, right? Texas is going to go, now we have a partner, let's go like turbocharged. And I think to a certain extent, that's what we're seeing.
Right. And I don't know,
budget-wise.
I don't know that it was foolish or not. I mean, I guess it's not for me to say, but what we do know is, immediately after the election, the governor and lieutenant governor separately floated this idea that the state might scale back. The lieutenant governor even mentioned like specific things that border security money could be allocated for instead. So there was like this kind of trial balloon floated that was like, oh, but we also must consider that in Texas, at least, like especially among Republican voters, according to polling, there's like an endless appetite for border security spending. So now we're seeing this doubling down. So yeah, for a hot minute, it was like, all right, we might cut back.
We're good. Yeah.
And now it's like, no.
Well, there's no doubt that politically it's good to say I'm spending so much money, but just policy wise, is it wise for the state to be spending that much money when there is a federal government that is theoretically doing these things already? And another thing to point out is that the governor has been going to D.C., having meetings with President Trump, having meetings with the congressional delegation about getting these $11 billion back. That's something that's been floated in the past before, and obviously has not worked, but it seems like maybe there's an appetite now to claw some of that money back. So that'll be interesting to see how it plays out, because I can't imagine that the other states will be too happy that Texas is getting $11 billion or some of that money back.
Right. It's a little bit of it's like you're setting up a little bit of a weird system, right? Of like, if we, in Texas's mind, right, like we're doing your job for you
Right.
on sort of on layaway, and then you give us the money back later is like, you're setting yourself up for some potential issues. But obviously, I'm sure the state would be thrilled to get $11 billion.
Also, it depends the state. I think some states would probably support a reimbursement, such as the governors who supported Operation Lone Star.
Right. They just might get in line for money too.
Well, and that's what I'm saying. Like Florida sent people, North Dakota, South Dakota sent people. So it's like they probably want reimbursements too.
Right. I just would like to say, like, if relevant, like I would put myself in, I would like $11 billion if we're offering it. I don't know for what. I've never spent $11 billion, but that'd be my preference.
Okay, Eleanor, we've talked about this before, but the feds are now following the blueprint that Texas has laid out on immigration enforcement, on the immigration crackdown. And I want you to talk a bit about how Texas sort of did that in courts through the legal system. And because this is like something that Texas has been doing for years now. And, Governor Abbott has talked about how the feds are now taking basically his model and taking it up to the big leagues. So can you shed some light on sort of what that looks like?
Yeah, I know this is something Alejandro and I have talked about a lot, so feel free to chime in as well. But I do think, Texas, on not just immigration, but on a number of issues, has sort of made this broader playbook, right, of like, do something that, they say it couldn't be done. Texas does it. We fight it through the courts, and like increasingly commonly, like, the courts side with Texas, in some cases because of their, novel legal theories holding up in some cases because, they are able to get this in front of judges that, friendly judges that sort of see their argument. The Fifth Circuit, obviously very conservative, and a lot of cases stall out there or, go to the Supreme Court, which also obviously has a conservative majority. So Texas has done that on a number of things that, then sort of become, legally more sound than they were when Texas first passed the law or first tried something.
Yeah.
Immigration, we definitely have seen that.
Because when they first present things, it sounds like, oh, that's crazy. That would
right.
never
You're
happen.
like, I think there's a lot of stuff. On immigration, on abortion, on other stuff where Texas is like pushing the envelope. Where like even we as reporters are like, ugh, like, do we even need to write about that? Like it's just like conservative grandstanding. And then it passes, and then it goes to court, and then sometimes it holds up. A lot of stuff does not end up holding up in court, we should say. But on immigration in particular, SB 4, I think, is an example of this. Like that has, setting up a legal theory that had not really been tested before, that legal experts feel like if it was upheld in court, it's not just about, is Texas's law sound or not? It's about like, it's these like macro questions of who has the authority to enforce immigration law, who has the authority to govern the border, and sort of like what makes us a United States of America, like these big questions. So Texas has definitely laid out the playbook for like, let's try stuff and let the courts tell us no. And we're certainly seeing that. I think the Trump administration is already doing a lot of stuff that Texas has laid out and tried. Just because the federal government is doing it does not automatically mean it's legal either, right? Like the Trump administration will face legal pushback.
Yeah.
That will go through the courts as well.
On things like executive orders on birthright citizenship, which we've already seen being challenged, right?
So it's going to be a similar playbook in that, which is like nothing is, immediate, but it still can slowly shift things.
Yeah. And just to clarify, that's SB 4, the most recent SB 4 from 2023, not SB 4, the Sanctuary Cities bill, which has also had some pretty novel ideas on how to enforce immigration. Alejandro, I want to go back to you. We discussed this previously on the show with our DC reporter, Matthew Choi. But there's a debate even among congressional Texas Republicans about how to go forward with the immigration enforcement that the president wants. Should it be more targeted towards people who have committed violent crimes, or is it just a sort of catch-all? Anybody who crosses an immigration enforcement person, that they're going to get picked up and deported? What are you seeing in the first couple of weeks of this Trump administration on that question?
Yeah, anecdotally, we're seeing that it's mostly everyone. Like if you are undocumented in this country, it appears the administration's posture is you are fair game for deportation, and this was kind of expected. Some people are surprised because they heard statements such as Trump and some of his advisors say that they were going to prioritize the most heinous criminals, people who've murdered, people who've raped, people who have been released on bond and then committed other crimes. Like Trump and his advisors focus often on these people, but what I think people either missed or didn't pay as much attention to is that the same people, including Trump and his advisors, would criminalize everyone by saying, well, if you're in the country illegally, you've broken a crime, so you are fair game, and which is what we're seeing now, and that is, I think it's fair to say, that is the administration's posture. The White House,
seen the press secretary Carolyn Leavitt say exactly those words.
Yeah, So it's kind of we've seen like kind of like A, this criminalization, but B, like the acting on it and being like, well, if you're undocumented, we're going to try to deport you. And we've seen this anecdotally in Texas. My colleagues and I have reported on that some, but also bigger picture. We've seen some reporting through leaks, other publications, that people who have no criminal history are being deported.
I would say like our colleague Oriel wrote a story from El Paso where he interviewed, he was like at a rally against some of this, and he interviewed someone who was like, I voted for Trump, but now I'm very worried he might deport, I believe it was like his father, who's undocumented. And I think there was this sense of like, well, my father is just, working, and he's not, hasn't, committed some heinous crime. Like, I don't think, Trump would start by going after him. And as we're seeing now, like the way that plays out is really surprising a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important. I imagine we're going to get into this, but it's also important to remember the impact on humans, right? Like we're talking, like this spreads fear. This raises a lot of concerns, questions.
That's actually our next topic. But before that, we're going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsors. Mexico, more than just a neighbor. For a timely cross-border insight, turn to former U.S. Ambassador Antonio Garza. Learn more at tonygarza.com. Deliver Texas-sized insight at your next event with the Texas Tribune Speakers Bureau. Our reporters and editors are ready to bring your event to life with context and analysis only they can deliver. Book us at texastribune.org/speakers. Alejandro, let's talk a bit about the impact on the undocumented community, which you rightfully brought up. Texas has the second largest population of undocumented people in the country behind California, largely because of our size. They power a lot of the industries here: construction, farming, service industry, food production. What can you say about the impact on those communities from this immigration crackdown? Because I know you've reported on some of this.
Yeah, it's huge and it's wide. We're talking about a very diverse population. It's estimated to be 1.6 million people who are undocumented in Texas, and the state has 30 million people, and that's an estimate, right? Based off people we can count. So yeah, they are essential workers. They work restaurants, they pick produce, but they're also small business owners. They're parents. They're members of communities up and down the state. So that's kind of why the impact's diverse. But I mean, what we've been reporting on and hearing is folks are concerned. Lives are already have been changed, even if people aren't being deported. Some folks are going straight to work and back home, and then maybe like mom, if she's an American, goes grocery shopping. Sometimes parents aren't sending kids to school. Sometimes they're not going to doctor's appointments. So I think what we're seeing is this change kind of unfold, and it's still, like I said at the beginning, the plan is still unclear. So I don't know where it goes from here, but we do know that people have fear, people have concerns, they're worried about their loved ones, they're altering their lives, and so on.
And you wrote this very interesting story about an undocumented man in Lubbock who was pulled over for a traffic violation. He ended up being referred to federal immigration authorities on that traffic stop. Tell us more about that and what it says about the overall state of play for immigration enforcement. Because I think you mentioned sort of mixed status families, and this I think was a mixed status family as well. If you can tell us a little bit more.
Yeah. So the story was about a man named Jose Alvaro. That's his first name. And he's married to an American citizen. They have 3 children who were all Americans. And they went out to buy baby formula last month. And there was some sort of issue with their vehicle's tag. So a cop pulls them over. And the wife, her name is Ashley, explains, hey, my husband's undocumented. He doesn't have a license, but I don't know how to drive, which is why he was driving. Here's the car's insurance and his passport. And according to Ashley, who was very kind to speak with me, the officer was really kind, goes back to his vehicle and calls ICE. So ICE shows up and takes Jose and begins removal proceedings. So now, I mean, that's the short version of the story. You could read the whole report, texastribune.org.
Nice.
But now this family's life has been upended. He's in removal proceedings. They have hearings. They have a court date in August, and the government's going to try to deport him. And this man has been in the country for several years. And I think to your question about what it says, we interviewed experts about this, and it kind of gets at the everyone is fair game idea, which is like if an administration sets directives for ICE agents, like prioritize these people or these people, they focus on that. It's like, all right, those are our efforts. But here we have one officer at his discretion calling ICE, and ICE being like, we're going to do this, and now they're deporting this person. So I think that's what it tells us, that there is kind of like a sort of randomness to the enforcement, that it could be anyone.
Right. And that has a deep impact on people in the undocumented community, because like you said, they were just going about doing a daily chore, a daily necessity kind of, and they were getting baby formula, you said? Yeah. So that sort of definitely complicates their lives, which is, to be fair, exactly what the administration wants to do and what immigration hardliners want to be happening. Like, they want their lives to be complicated so that they either don't come or are eventually caught by federal immigration.
And we should say, like, the Trump administration has rolled back there were some protections or sort of guidelines on where ICE agents would and wouldn't go, right? Like, they wouldn't go into healthcare facilities, they wouldn't go into churches.
Right. Schools, churches.
Yes, schools, that's the other one, yes. Schools, churches, healthcare facilities, and that has now been rolled back. And so I think there's sort of a sense of, like, anyone anywhere is at potentially at risk,
open
which
season, yeah.
right is seen as a deterrent. But for the people that are already here, like it's also like those people who have to go to work or those
Yep.
you know.
Right. And this person was, I think, in some immigration proceedings. Did you mention that already?
Yeah,
Yeah.
they were trying to get a green card. So as you know, and which is a long, arduous, expensive process. They had a lawyer. So the way that their lawyer looks at it, and she also spoke to me for the story, is in a lot of ways, like according to the system, however you read it, is like he kind of went about it the right way after being here, which is he met someone, they fell in love, they had kids, they got married, and they were going through the proceedings. And now they are presented with this sort of existential question of, well, should he be deported? What are we going to do as a family?
Yeah. And I think that's the sort of thinking that a lot of people in the immigrant community are thinking, like, how many risks can I take? Because, like I said, they were just doing a daily necessity, which will be interesting. And potentially complicating that even more is what our state officials want to do at the state level. We've seen Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick push a priority bill that would require cities and counties to cooperate with federal immigration enforcement. Eleanor, can you just chime in here a little bit about what that kind of legislation, which inevitably is going to be controversial at the legislature, Democrats will strongly push back against that. What that kind of bill would do to a session that so far everybody seems like they're on their best behavior
right.
and
We're
they're
all
all
friendly. We're
aligned.
all
Exactly.
good. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think any bill that is controversial, and we should say like a bill like that is controversial on two fronts, right? Immigration, but also this question of like local control and preemption and
Right.
how much can the state tell these big cities what to do and how to run their governments basically is just potentially something that can like grind the whole thing to a halt. And I think, anytime I think as we talked about last week, right, Dan Patrick, 40 priorities, certainly feels like he has enough control over the Senate to like push through what he wants. But anytime you're throwing something controversial in the mix, you are potentially, it takes time, it takes like floor fights, it takes horse trading, it takes negotiations, it takes conference committees, like you're just dragging it out in a session where, I mean, obviously Governor Abbott says he supports this measure, but Governor Abbott, Republican leadership, the House certainly seems to have blinders on and saying, like, we have one thing to do this session, like pass vouchers, stay focused, use our capital on that. And now we maybe are going to throw this in the mix.
Right. And I mean, the thing about Governor Abbott's, I guess, position on this is that he did throw out support for this, but it's not an emergency item. It's not a priority item. So I think that sort of tells you something. I think he probably thinks it can get done, but like you said, the blinders. Like, here
Vouchers,
are the
right,
goals. He
right.
laid out 7 of them. They're mostly in line with what Speaker Burrows has said he wants to get done. And so if you got to focus on these 7, do you really want to be taking up a big fight over here over something that's definitely going to split Democrats and Republicans, and potentially even some Republicans?
Right. It's like it's like just like do not pass go, do not collect $200, pass vouchers,
Right.
and like shut up about the rest of it. Seems to be some vibes that we're getting, even while Governor Abbott is throwing his support behind some other measures.
Alejandro, just taking it back one step, can you sort of just give us just context about like how the numbers are in terms of migrant crossings compared to when President Biden was in office or the first Trump administration? Like, how necessary are some of these enforcement measures that we're seeing?
Well, I think those are two questions. The border's quiet. I think a quiet border got even quieter since Trump took office. And it started getting quiet kind of last year, really, from record number of illegal crossings in December 2023. Biden implemented a couple orders that really kind of helped reduce that. According to his advisors when they were in office, they took credit. But also a big part of it is Mexico's enforcement and some countries in Central America. But essentially what we're seeing is low numbers, fewer people than in recent years are trying to cross the border. Now, the second question you ask, is this necessary? Well, I mean, I think that's an opinion, and the current president, President Trump, is of the opinion that it is. He's declared an invasion. He still thinks like the hundreds of crossings that we're seeing now is enough to merit his actions. Will that be challenged? that remains to be seen.
Yeah, and important to note Mexico's participation in this, because they certainly had a lot of tough enforcement on their southern border, and now they've got enforcement on their northern border. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has sent, I think, 10,000 National Guard troops of her own National Guard up there in this sort of trade over stopping tariffs. So they're playing a role as well. So, but it seems like a lot of it is also just politics of like he made these campaign promises. And he wants to deliver on them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the other thing is like all of this is happening so fast in the beginning of the administration, sort of as promised. I think that's what we expected. And it takes some time for like the impact to be seen, obviously in terms of border crossings, in terms of deportations, but also in terms of like, there was a lot of outrage during the last Trump administration about, family separation and sort of the way these policies were being implemented. It took a little while for like, them to be fully implemented and people to become aware of them and there to be sort of more pushback against them. And so I think, we've seen protests already at the Capitol about immigration. I think we've seen protests in cities across the state, across the country about President Trump's immigration policies. But I also think we can expect pretty significant political pushback on this, depending on like how this all plays out.
Yeah, maybe if people start realizing I don't know, like the situation that you wrote about where it's a mixed status family. There's a person who's an American citizen, but their partner is not, people have family members and have good friends that are undocumented. And if they're friends, they may not know it. If they're family, they definitely know it. And if something happens to those people, there is potential for that backlash. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, and like if the price of food or eggs goes up because we don't have people work, it's like
Right.
some of that takes a while to develop. But I do think, President Trump's like very focused energy on this issue means like a lot is changing really fast, and how the impact of all of those changes sort of may take a little bit longer to see.
Yeah.
I think that's also. Oh, sorry. I think that's also like a big question that remains to be seen. My colleagues and I haven't covered as much, but I've read other coverage. Is like, well, what does that resistance look like? Because definitely in Texas, we haven't seen any mayors or county judges, really pick a fight, be like, we're not doing this. And part of that might be fear. I mean, Trump ordered federal prosecutors to investigate such local officials who get in the way. So I think that's also a big question as we look ahead.
Okay, cool. I think that's a good place to stop. But
Can I say one more thing before we go?
Sure, Eleanor.
We would be remiss if we did not wish a happy birthday to our Texas Tribune TribCast co-host.
Thank you.
James Barragan.
and you wanted to sing? You told me.
Yeah, that's what it is. We wanted him to sing, actually.
Thank you so
yes.
much.
No, happy birthday.
Okay,
Happy
thank
birthday,
you,
James.
We're going to end the conversation here, but want to remind our listeners, if you have burning questions for us that you want us to discuss about the latest in Texas politics, please send them to tribcast@texastribune.org, and we will try to get them on a segment of the show. Again, that's tribcast@texastribune.org. We hope to hear from you. That's all the time we have for this week's episode of the TribCast. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our feed and to leave feedback on the podcast app of your choice to help other listeners find us. And please recommend the show to a friend. Thank you to our sponsors, former U.S. Ambassador to Mexico, Antonio Garza, and the Texas Tribune Speakers Bureau. Our producers are Rob Avila and Chris Svoboda. Our theme music is composed by Rob. Join us again next week.